He had not meant to stop. The path to the north cottage cut through a stand of birch, their white trunks pale against the November sky, and he had come to assess the building as he had been assessing every outbuilding and fence line and ditch on the Ashmore estate for the past 18 months, methodically, without sentiment, the way a man takes inventory of a campaign he has been handed mid-battle. He carried no brief for this particular square of stone and slate. His solicitor had marked it on the survey map in red ink, a small notation that read, "Occupied, unregistered," and the notation was an irregularity. And Edmund Ware had long since learned that irregularities did not improve with neglect. He heard the voice before he saw the window. A child's voice, stumbling over syllables. Then a woman's, quiet and unhurried, saying the word again, not correcting exactly, but shaping it from underneath, the way one might cup a hand under a candle flame against the wind. Edmund slowed without thinking. He moved to the left, where the birch grove thinned and the cottage window caught the gray morning light. And he looked through the glass before he had quite decided to look. The room was small, ordered with a precision that surprised him. A kitchen table scrubbed pale, 2 chairs, a shelf of books that had no business being in a working cottage, and at the table a boy of perhaps 9 years old, fair-haired and earnest, his finger tracing a line of print in a large Bible. Across from him, her back partly turned to the window, sat a young woman. She wore a gray wool gown, plain and well-mended, and her dark hair was pinned simply at the nape of her neck. She was pointing at the page and saying something Edmund could not hear through the glass, and the boy nodded and tried the word again. And when he got it right, her face turned slightly, and Edmund saw her smile. He stood in the cold for a long moment, longer than he should have. The frost on the dead grass was still hard under his boots, and his breath rose in small clouds, and he did not knock. When he finally turned away, he was aware of something he could not immediately name. He walked back to the birch trees. He did not take the note from his coat pocket. He did not mark anything on the survey map. He walked home in the cold, and he thought about her smile, and he did not knock for another 4 days. He thought, in those 4 days, about the particular quality of a room that has been made habitable by someone who had every reason not to bother. He had seen enough of the houses in his care to know the difference between a dwelling maintained and a dwelling inhabited. The cottage had been inhabited. There were small, deliberate choices visible in every corner of it, in the way the herbs were bundled and hung at the kitchen window, not merely to dry, but at a height that would allow them light, the way the hearthstone was swept clean, and a small piece of slate placed at its edge to protect the wooden floor from rolled coals. These were the choices of someone who had decided the place was worth the effort, even when no one was watching to assess the effort. And they unsettled him in a way that the property survey had not prepared him for. Marian Holt had learned to count the things the cottage cost her before she counted the things it gave. It cost her the right to be surprised. She had lived in the place long enough that each winter's particular cruelties had become known quantities. She knew which window leaked when the east wind came. She knew that the chimney drew badly on certain mornings, and that the trick was to lay the tinder differently, with a gap on the left side. She knew that the north wall sweated in February, and she kept her father's books away from it. She had learned these things the way one learns the particular contours of a grief, not by being told, but by meeting them in the dark. Her father had come to the cottage first, in the autumn of his 58th year, when his living had been surrendered to a younger man, and there had been nothing left to do but accept the offer that old Mr. Croft, the Ashmore steward, had pressed on him out of a decency that cost Croft nothing, and gave the Reverend everything. The north cottage was unused, Croft had said, has been for years. No one will notice you here. Stay through the winter, and we'll find something better in the spring." The spring had come. Nothing better had arrived. Her father had stayed on, and she had stayed with him. And there had been a second winter and a third. And when the fever took the Reverend Holt in the February of that third year, old Croft was already 2 months in his own grave, and there was no one left who knew she was there. She had not told anyone she was staying. There had not seemed to be anyone to tell. The first winter, she had lived on the stores her father had laid in for autumn, and on the charity of Mrs. Peel, the widowed woman at the village's edge who brought bread and vegetables twice a week because she had known Reverend Holt from his first sermon, and because she was the kind of person who did what was useful without requiring thanks or audience. Marian had tried, that first winter, to feel that her situation was temporary. She had written to her father's cousin in Bristol, twice, without reply. She had written to the bishop's secretary, explaining the circumstances of the living's surrender. No answer had come before the snow. By the time the thaw arrived and she might have gone, she had understood, with the particular clarity that cold months have a way of producing, that there was nowhere to go that was better than here, and several places considerably worse. The second winter she had the kitchen garden in hand and a regular arrangement with the rector, and she had stopped thinking about it as temporary. That was the winter her father died, in February, of a lung complaint that had announced itself in autumn and proceeded with the grim patience of something that had made up its mind. She had nursed him through the dark weeks without sending for anyone, because there was no one close enough to send for. And when it was over, she had sat in the kitchen for a very long time, and then she had gone to bed. And in the morning she had risen and tended the fire and made tea and taken the rector's copying work to the small desk by the window, and continued. Instead, she had written careful letters to the Ashmore estate, addressed to the steward's office, noting her circumstances and requesting, formally, whether she might remain for the season while she made other arrangements. No reply had come. She had written again. Still nothing. The estate, she would later learn, had been in legal confusion for the better part of a year, while the question of the inheritance was settled in London, and her letters had sat in a folder in an empty office and been read by no one. So she had planted the kitchen garden in April. She had repaired the window herself, with a piece of wooden beading from the garden shed. She had taken the copying work from the rector at Ashmore Village, 2 shillings per letter, and she had made the arithmetic work through the summer and autumn. And then the winter had come again. The 4th now. And she was still here. And she had not asked permission in 18 months, because there was no longer anyone to ask. It was Gascoigne, the solicitor who had arrived from London to compile the new property inventory, who first used the word. He had said it to the undergardener at the Hall's stable yard, not troubling to lower his voice, while showing the man the survey map with its small red notation. He said the estate had a squatter in the North Cottage, and that the situation would need to be clarified before the spring. The undergardener had not said anything. Neither had anyone else. The word had reached Marian by ways she had not expected, and through ears she had not known were listening, and it sat in her chest with the particular weight of a label that was technically accurate and entirely wrong. The first time Edmund Ware knocked on her door, Marian had been drying herbs at the kitchen window. She heard the knock, and her hands went still, and she waited one careful breath before she turned around. He was taller than she had expected a lord to be, and he wore a dark navy coat with silver buttons, the kind of coat that had cost more than she earned in a year. And he held his hat in his hands, and he did not come inside until she invited him. She invited him because it was her cottage, regardless of what his survey map said, and she was not going to begin by behaving as if it were not. He accepted the invitation without remark and stepped inside, and immediately the room was different. He was built like a man who had spent a decade outdoors and not behind a desk, and the kitchen ceiling was low enough that he moved with a particular care, not stooping exactly, but adjusted. His eyes went around the room with the trained efficiency of a man who had been assessing property for a very long time. They stopped at the bookshelves. 4 shelves, floor to nearly ceiling on the east wall, her father's theology and Latin, and a handful of novels Marian had acquired through the rector's cast-offs. The spines were faded, but the volumes were straight, and the shelves were clean, and there was nothing in their arrangement that was other than entirely intentional. Edmund looked at them for a long moment. He did not say anything immediately. Neither did she. "Who reads these?" he said at last. "I do," she said. He turned and looked at her. Not the assessing inventory look. Something different. Briefer. As if she had surprised him and he did not mean her to know it. He said that he would not require her to leave immediately. He said that Mr. Gascoigne would be in contact regarding her formal arrangement with the estate, and that he hoped she understood the irregularity of her position. He said these things in a voice that was level and careful, as a man delivers a prepared speech, and Marian listened to all of it and said that she understood perfectly and thanked him for calling, and held the door. When he was gone, she found his greatcoat slung over the chair nearest the fire, where he had set it while talking. He had not taken it when he left. In the left-hand chimney nook, where the coat had rested against the stone, there was a single navy button that had come loose from the cuff. She held it in her palm. It was an ordinary button. Tin, dyed to match the wool, with a small anchor pressed into its face. She did not know why she kept it. She set it on the windowsill beside the kitchen herbs, and it sat there, small and incongruous and entirely without explanation. And she left it where it was. If you have ever known someone before you knew them, you will understand what happened next. There are those who would like to leave a comment on that idea before we continue. The story will be here when you return. He came back 6 times in the following 3 weeks. Each time he had a reason. The survey required clarification of the kitchen garden's boundaries. The window on the north wall needed the estate's carpenter to look at it. The chimney drew badly. Had she complained to the previous steward, he would have Croft's accounts checked. Each reason was coherent. Each reason was, Marian noted privately, thin enough to see through if one looked at a certain angle. And she did not look. She answered his questions about the garden's boundaries with exact measurements she had recorded herself. She showed him the window she had repaired and said it did not require the estate's carpenter now or previously. She told him the chimney was manageable. He sat at her kitchen table for the first time during the 3rd visit. When the rain came on while he was examining the north wall, and she offered him tea with a brevity intended to make clear it was practical rather than social. He accepted with a brevity that matched hers and sat across from her, and she was acutely aware, in a way she could not have prepared for, of how small the cottage became with him in it. He was not the largest man she had ever seen, but the cottage had been built for her father's modest dimensions and her own, and he folded himself into one of her kitchen chairs with the particular economy of a large man in a small space, and he folded his hands on the table as if the table were the one thing in the room he was fully certain of. She made herself look at the kettle. She made herself think about the rain. The 4th visit, he arrived when Tom Rigby was there. Tom was 8 years old, the blacksmith's son, who had appeared at her door one afternoon 6 weeks prior with a message from his mother, and remained because the Bible on the table had caught his eye, and Marian had, almost without deciding to, turned it toward him and pointed at a line. He came back 3 days later, and 3 days after that. He was at the table with the Bible open when Edmund knocked, and neither Marian nor Tom had heard him coming. Edmund stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the table, at the boy's finger on the page, at Marion's hand resting beside the text. And he said that he had not meant to interrupt, and he would return another time. Marion said there was no interruption. Tom said, without looking up, that he was getting the long words. Edmund sat in the other chair and watched Tom read out the long words, 2 of them correctly, one requiring a 3rd attempt. When Marion adjusted the boy's pronunciation, her voice was unhurried and entirely warm. The kind of voice that came from a face that was not watching itself. Edmund did not take out his survey map. He stayed for the better part of an hour after Tom went home. He did not pretend, this time, to have a reason for the visit. Instead, he shed his greatcoat, because the fire was good, and the room was warm, and he sat with his tea going cold on the table before him. And he said, with his eyes on the bookshelves, that he had not known the Reverend Holt. He said he had not known most of the people on this estate, and that this was a failure he was still in the process of understanding. Marion said that her father had been here for 3 years and 3 winters, and had spoken very well of Mr. Croft. Edmund said that Croft had died 6 months before he himself arrived. He said he had found a great many things that Croft had managed, and that had not been recorded anywhere except in Croft's memory. There was a long pause. "You were not meant to have this estate," Marion said. It was not a question. He looked at her. His face was the face of a man accustomed to not being read, and she had just read him, and they both knew it. "No," he said. "My brother James was to have it. He died in the spring of 1815, of a fever, while I was with my regiment in Spain." He said this in a measured voice with his right hand perfectly still on the table, the way a man holds himself when he has decided not to let himself move. I had extended my commission twice. James had always managed the estate in my absence, and I had always assumed I would return and find it as I left it. I did not return until I was required to. She did not say she was sorry. He was not the kind of man who received condolence gracefully, and she had met enough grief herself to know that sorry was not always what one needed. She said, "You came back and learned it." "I came back and began," he said. "There is a difference." She watched him. The fire behind him made his silhouette very still, and she understood that what he had told her was not a small thing to tell. It had cost him something to say it plainly, to say it to a woman he had met 6 weeks ago in a cottage he had not known he owned, without the framing of rank or the distance of condolence. He had said it the way people say the things they carry alone. Not to be comforted, but to hear the weight of it spoken aloud in a room where someone would not look away. "Your brother was older," she said, "by 4 years. He was better suited to it than I was. He knew the families. He could name the children of the tenants from memory, which ones were apprenticed, which ones had debts, which ones were too proud to ask for an extension of the harvest rent." He paused. "I am still learning the names." "You have been here 18 months, Marion said. He looked at her, as if she had said something more than she had said. "Yes," he said. 18 months. There was something in the way he said it that she turned over after he was gone. Something about the precision of the count. 18 months. Not nearly 2 years, but exactly 18 months. The way a person numbers time they are serving rather than spending. He left an hour later and took his coat and did not take the button. She had picked it up from the windowsill before he arrived and set it on the table between them, in case he wanted it, and he had not mentioned it, and neither had she. And when he was gone, she put it back on the windowsill and looked at it for a long moment, and then made herself go to bed. It was in that same week that Mrs. Rathbone arrived at Ashmore Hall. Edmund's aunt was a handsome woman of 60, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades managing households larger than the one before her, and the serene confidence of a person whose methods had worked so consistently that she had stopped questioning them. She arrived with Miss Prudence Alderwick, whose father was Sir George Alderwick of the Staffordshire branch, and whose mother was a Cavendish connection, and whose person was as correct as a person could reasonably be. Miss Alderwick was fair, composed, and polite. She had a way of entering a room that suggested the room had been waiting for her. Mrs. Rathbone established herself at the hall with the efficiency of a general taking a position that was rightfully hers, organized the dining table for a dinner of 12, and said within the first evening that it was past time Edmund's affairs were ordered properly. She was not wrong, in the way that Marian had come to understand the wrongnesses of people like her, which was to say that her facts were accurate, and her conclusions were entirely certain, and it was only the premises she could not be made to examine. Edmund did need an establishment. Edmund did need to attend to the estate's social position in the county. Edmund did need, if he were to do his duty by Ashmore, to make a match that would give the house an heir, and the county a countess whose credentials were beyond question. All of this was true, and none of it was what Marian thought about when she thought about Edmund in his kitchen chair, his hands folded on the table, saying there is a difference. Miss Prudence Alderwick came to the hall for a week and stayed a fortnight. She was everything she was supposed to be. She rode well. She spoke French with an accent that was almost certainly genuine. She sat at the hall's pianoforte and played the pieces she was supposed to play with a precision that made the instrument sound like what it was, a well-maintained machine in the hands of a well-trained person. She was polite to the servants without being familiar. She was polite to Edmund without being warm. Marian had heard all of this from the village. From Mrs. Peel, who had it from the hall's laundress, who said that Miss Alderwick ironed her own handkerchiefs, which was either a virtue or an indictment, depending on one's view of what a great house required. Marian did not know about the dinner until the day before it. When Edmund came to the cottage to tell her she was expected at the hall the following morning, he said that Gascoigne needed to clarify several matters regarding the North Cottage, and that it would be best to have the conversation formally, with all parties present. She asked which parties. He said that his aunt and Mr. Gascoigne would both be there, and possibly one or two others. He said it as if it were ordinary, as if he were scheduling a survey consultation rather than a judgment, and he looked out the window while he said it. And Marian noted that his jaw had that particular quality of carved stone that it had when he was choosing his words rather than finding them. She said she would come. The following morning she walked the mile to Ashmore Hall and was shown to the east drawing room, a handsome room of pale walls and a good fire, and given tea by a footman who could not quite meet her eyes. She had been waiting perhaps 30 minutes when she heard voices from the dining room across the passage. The door was not properly latched. She had not closed it any further than she found it. Mr. Gascoigne's voice was precise and carrying. He said that the North Cottage occupied a portion of the estate that would significantly improve the value of the North Field sale if it were included in the boundary rationalization, and that the current situation, a squatter with no legal standing and no documentation, was an irregularity that reflected poorly on the estate's administration. He said this clearly and completely, as a man delivers a report. Mrs. Rathbone said, in the tone of someone confirming an obvious arrangement, that the squatter situation had gone on long enough and that the woman ought to have applied to the parish like any other person in her circumstances. Marian sat very still in the east drawing room. The fire was good. The tea was cold. She waited for Edmund's voice. She heard Miss Alderwick say something in a lower register that she could not make out. She heard the clink of a glass. She heard Mr. Gascoigne continuing his summary of the boundary survey. Edmund said nothing. She sat with that silence for the length of a slow breath, and then she set her cup on the tray with the care of someone who is not going to let her hands show anything. And she stood, and she put on her coat, and she walked to the hall's east entrance, and let herself out without speaking to anyone. The mile back to the cottage was cold, and she walked it quickly. The frost had come back in the night, and the grass crackled under her boots. She did not think on the walk about Edmund, or about Gascoigne, or about the word squatter and the way it had moved through the hall's rooms and down to its servants and back up to her. She thought about practical things, what she could carry in the portmanteau, what she would need to leave, whether the rector would extend her a month's copying work while she found a situation. She had been good at practical thinking for 3 years, and she was very good at it now. When she reached the cottage, she went directly to the bedroom and took down her father's portmanteau from the top of the wardrobe. She opened it. She looked at it for a moment, at the worn leather and the brass clasps her father had polished out of habit on Sunday mornings, and she waited for something in herself to object. Nothing did. Then she began, very carefully and precisely, to place her father's books inside it. She had packed perhaps a third of the shelf when there was a knock at the door, and she opened it to find the young footman who had brought her tea, a boy of perhaps 17, his face red from the cold. And something else. He said that he had come to see if she needed anything, and that he was very sorry about everything, and that the servants' hall was saying things he thought she ought to know. She asked what things. He said they were calling her the squatter. He said Mrs. Rathbone had been using the word at dinner, and that it had come down to the kitchen and spread, the way these things did. And he was sorry. He wanted her to know it was not what everyone thought. Only he could not say that at the hall without losing his position. She said she understood, and thanked him, and closed the door. She stood with her back against the door in the cold cottage, and looked at the portmanteau and the half-emptied shelves. And she thought about her father's voice reading aloud in this room in the evenings. And she thought about Tom Rigby getting the long words right. And she thought about the silence from the dining room, which had been the only answer she needed. She went back to the shelf. She kept packing. He arrived at dawn. Not alone. That was the first thing she registered when she heard the knock and opened the door into the gray morning light. Edmund stood on the step with his coat half-buttoned, and behind him, at a few paces' distance, were Mr. Gascoigne with his leather case and Mrs. Rathbone in a fur-trimmed mantle, and, slightly to the side, Miss Prudence Alderwick, who looked as if she had been awakened at an hour she would not normally keep, and was composed about it in the way that very well-bred people are composed about things they find uncomfortable. Edmund looked at the portmanteau sitting open in the middle of the kitchen floor. He looked at the half-emptied shelves. He looked at Marian. "Come to the hall," he said. "No," she said. His jaw did the thing it did. He held her gaze for a moment, and she held his, and the cold morning air moved between them, and then he turned and said, to the small group behind him, "Come inside, please." He said it to Gascoigne and Mrs. Rathbone with the tone of a man giving orders he expects to be obeyed. They came inside. The cottage was not built for 5 people, and it showed. Mrs. Rathbone looked at the portmanteau with an expression of careful neutrality. Gascoigne opened his leather case and produced the survey map. Miss Alderwick stood near the door. Edmund did not consult the survey map. He stood in the middle of Marian's kitchen, with his hands at his sides, and he said, addressing himself to Gascoigne, that the Northfield sale was discontinued. He said the boundary rationalization was no longer under consideration. He said this in a voice as level as the surface of a frozen pond, and Gascoigne looked up from his papers with an expression of a man who has had the ground rearranged under him. Then Edmund turned, and he looked at Mrs. Rathbone, and he said in the same voice, "Miss Holt remains. The cottage, and everything in it, is hers." 11 words. 12 including her name. Mrs. Rathbone did not speak immediately. She looked at Edmund with an expression that was not quite surprise, because she was a woman who had spent 60 years learning not to be surprised in front of others. But there was something at the edge of it, something that recognized the ground had shifted and was calculating what came next. What came next was that she inclined her head, very slightly, and said that she had understood him. Gascoigne said that the legal transfer would require documentation. Edmund said he was aware of what documentation was required. Gascoigne said there would be the question of the Northfield sale and the boundary rationalization, which would need to be reconsidered in light of the new arrangement. Edmund said the Northfield was not for sale. Gascoigne pressed the leather case under his arm and looked at his employer with the expression of a man who had prepared very thoroughly for a conversation that had abruptly ceased to be the conversation he had prepared for. He said that the figure they had discussed with the prospective buyer was quite considerable. Edmund said he was aware of what the figure was. Miss Alderwick said nothing. She looked at Marian once, a single clear look, and Marian had the impression that Miss Alderwick had understood the shape of this morning rather earlier than anyone else in the room, and had come not to fight it, but to witness it, in the way that composed people sometimes do when they have decided there is nothing to be done, and dignity is the only remaining choice. Gascoigne closed his leather case. Mrs. Rathbone moved toward the door, and Miss Alderwick followed, and Gascoigne went after them. And then there were only 2 people in the cottage. The portmanteau sat between them on the floor, open, with her father's books inside it. Edmund looked at it, and then he looked at her, and the silence in the cottage was the kind that has a great deal inside it. "I did not speak at dinner," he said. He said it without framing it as an apology or an explanation. He said it as a fact he was placing on the table between them. "No," she said. "I had not decided," he said. "That is not the same as having decided against you. But I understand why it reads the same from where you were standing." Marian thought about the east drawing-room and the cold tea and the sound of Gascoigne's voice carrying under the unlatched door, and she said, "I have been deciding for 3 years what I am going to do next, and I have always been the only person deciding. I had become accustomed to it." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I know." He said it quietly, and he said it as if he had been thinking about it for some time. The fire needed tending, and she went to tend it, because it was her cottage and her fire. And while she knelt with the poker, she was aware of him crossing the room without being asked, taking a small piece of wood from the basket, setting it carefully in the grate in the particular way she had shown the grate required. He had watched her do it during the 4th visit. He had remembered. She sat back on her heels. He remained where he was, crouched beside her at the fire, and they were closer than they had ever been. And she was aware of it with a precision that had nothing to do with reasoning. "I am not going to ask you to come to the hall," he said. "Good," she said. "I am going to ask whether I may come here." She looked at him, and he was looking at the fire. And his profile in the firelight was the profile she had memorized in the way one memorizes something one is not meant to be memorizing. And she thought about the button on the windowsill, and what it had meant to her that she had kept it, and what it meant that he had not taken it. "Yes," she said. "You may come here." He stood, and he offered her his hand, and she took it, and rose, and they stood in the small kitchen with the fire going well now and the cold morning pressing at the windows, and neither of them moved immediately. They both knew what this was. They both stood inside it for a breath. 2 breaths. A held moment that was not hesitation, but something else. The kind of pause one makes before a door that will not close behind you. He said her name. Her given name. Marian. One of the only times he had used it. And the sound of it in his voice was what she had been keeping the button for, though she had not known that until just now. Marian, he said. She did not answer. She looked at his hand, still holding hers, and she thought about 3 winters and the arithmetic she had made work, and the East drawing room, and the 11 words he had said in front of witnesses, and she thought, with a clarity that arrived very quietly, that she was not afraid. The first winter she had not expected to last. The second she had survived on stubbornness. The third she had lived. Properly. Because by then she had stopped waiting to be permitted and begun inhabiting the space as hers. And there was a version of being seen that asked nothing of you but that, which was to simply be what you were in the place where you were, and to go on being it until someone finally looked. He had looked. He had been looking for rather longer than either of them had acknowledged. She did not let go of his hand. He did not move to the door immediately. He stood where he was, and she stood where she was, and the portmanteau sat on the floor between them with its brass clasps catching the early light, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. And in that silence, Marian understood that some things could not be managed 1 paragraph at a time. She had been managing things 1 paragraph at a time for 3 years. She had been very good at it. She would probably continue to be good at it, because it was the way she had learned to live. And the learning had been thorough. She understood. Standing in the kitchen of the cottage that was now, in the eyes of the law and the word of the Earl of Ashmore, entirely and irrevocably hers, that the next part of her life was not going to be managed. It was going to be lived. There was a difference. She looked up at him. He was looking at her. And his face was not the face of the inventory, or the survey, or the 12 words spoken in front of witnesses. It was the face he had had at the bookshelves. The first time, briefly, when she had surprised him and he had not meant her to know it. He had been known before he was understood. She recognized this because it was what had happened to her. "We are going to require a larger table," she said. It took him a moment. Then something happened at the corner of his mouth, something brief and very nearly a smile, the kind of expression on a face that has been still for a very long time. And he said, his voice entirely level, that he would see to it. 6 months later, when the 4th winter came to the North Cottage, it came to a place that was entirely different and entirely the same. The deed was drawn and registered, neat, official, with the particular finality of ink on paper. The kitchen shelves held all her father's books plus 4 that Edmund had brought over from the hall's library in October, titles she had mentioned once in passing and had not expected him to retain. The window latch on the north wall had been repaired properly at last by the estate's carpenter, who had been very respectful and very thorough, and had said nothing about the survey map or the north field, or anything at all, except that it was a good, solid wall, and he was glad of the work. Old Mrs. Peel came on Tuesdays and Thursdays, as she always had, with a small loaf and the village news, and she accepted the cup of tea she was always offered, with the satisfaction of a woman who has never been surprised by anything. And she looked around the cottage with its 2 cups on the shelf instead of 1, and she said nothing about that either. Tom Rigby had moved through the Old Testament and was finding the New Testament considerably easier, which Marian had told him was her father's view as well. Edmund came in the evenings when the estate work was done, and he came in the mornings before it had begun. and he sat in the chair that had become his chair with the same economy of a large man in a small room, and the cottage contained him the way the cottage contained everything, which was to say it was somewhat too small for him, and altogether the right size. On the evening of the first hard frost of December, when the snow came properly and lay blue against the window pane, Marian stood at the kitchen fire and heard Edmund's boots on the path, and did not need to look out to know it was him. And when he came inside, he brought the cold in with him, and then the cold resolved into the warmth of the room and the fire, and he stood at her back for a moment, before he put his arms around her, and she set her hands over his, and looked at the snow coming down past the window. On the windowsill, beside the dried herbs and the small earthenware pot her father had used for his pen nibs, the navy button sat where she had kept it for 4 months. He had never asked for it back. She had never returned it. It was simply there, small and particular, a record of the first time she had understood that something was beginning, even when she could not yet have said what. She looked at it in the firelight, and then she looked at the snow. The world outside was white and still and entirely itself, and the cottage was warm, and she was here, and she had been here through 3 winters before she was found, and she would be here still. If Marian's story stayed with you, leave a thought in the comments, and thank you, truly, for listening until the end.